I never thought that one day I would share something like this. I spent my entire life dedicated to the church, serving as a priest, devoting myself to prayer and the spiritual guidance of the faithful. From a young age, my vocation was clear: to follow God and lead others along the same path. For me, faith was never just a duty, but a calling, something that pulsed with every beat of my heart. I believed that I understood the divine well, that my life of devotion and study had prepared me for any celestial mystery. But I was mistaken. What I experienced that Sunday morning changed everything I thought I knew about God, the church, and the very destiny of humanity. That day, the parish was full. Entire families, the elderly, young people, all gathered for the celebration of Mass. The aroma of incense still lingered in the air, and the soft light from the stained glass painted colorful reflections on the stone floor. The choir sang softly in the background, and I prepared for the consecration of the Eucharist, feeling in my heart that familiar sense of communion with the sacred. It was a day like any other, one of those moments when I felt exactly where I was supposed to be. But then, without any warning, everything changed. It was as if something invisible had struck me with an indescribable force. An overwhelming pain exploded in my chest, so intense that my knees gave way instantly. It was as if an invisible, gigantic hand were squeezing my heart with brutal pressure. The air fled from my lungs. A buzzing sound began to fill my ears, and the world around me started spinning. The voices of the faithful, once so clear, became distant, as if coming from underwater. My vision darkened at the edges, flickering between shadows and light. I tried to speak. I tried to cling to the edge of the altar for support, but my body no longer obeyed me. I felt a strange cold run down my spine. And then, nothing. Just absolute silence. Time seemed to have stopped. Somehow I knew that my earthly life had come to an end. Yet, contrary to what I had always imagined about death, there was no terror, there was no despair, only a profound peace, as if all the worries of existence had been snatched away in a single moment. When I opened my eyes again, I saw something that left me completely speechless: my own body lying before the altar. The scene seemed unreal, as if I were watching a movie, but I knew it wasn't a dream. There I was, motionless, surrounded by panicked faithful. Some knelt beside me, trying to revive me, while others just watched, paralyzed by shock. I saw a woman covering her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide with pure despair. One of the parish ministers held my cold hands, murmuring prayers through tears. The sound of voices, hurried footsteps, and bells echoed in a strange way, as if coming from far away, from a reality to which I no longer belonged. And then I realized something even more unsettling. I was not just seeing the scene. Below, I was floating above it. But contrary to what anyone would expect when experiencing something like this, I felt no fear, no panic, no anguish. On the contrary, an overwhelming peace took hold of me. It was as if the entire weight of existence had been lifted from my shoulders, as if I had been freed from something I never realized I was carrying. What impressed me most was the lightness, not only of the body, but of the soul. Everything seemed so clear, so serene, as if I had finally awakened after a long life of dreams. I looked at my hands, or what should have been my hands, and saw that they were different. They were not made of flesh, but of something translucent, shining, like liquid light. And then I felt it. Something was calling me, not with words, not with sound, but with a silent, irresistible force that began to pull me upward. At first it was a gentle movement, almost imperceptible, as if I were being carried by an invisible breeze. But soon the force intensified, and I realized I was rising, not because I wanted to, but because something much greater than me was calling. The church, the faithful, my own body, all began to recede slowly. I saw paramedics arriving in a hurry, opening their bags, preparing the defibrillator. One of the doctors pressed his palms against my chest and shouted something before administering the first electric shock. My body convulsed under the impact, but I felt nothing. There was no longer any connection between me and that matter which had once been my home, and yet nothing inside me cried out to return. I simply moved forward, being drawn by something far beyond human comprehension. Then I saw for the first time, above me, where the church ceiling should have been, there was nothing but an infinite void. But it was not a dark or frightening void. On the contrary, it was vast, majestic, filled with a light unlike anything I had ever seen on earth. It was not just brightness, it was alive. It pulsed like a heart, radiating warmth and peace in an indescribable way. And in that instant, I knew. Without anyone having to tell me, without needing proofs or explanations, I simply knew I was heading toward God. This truth overwhelmed me with such certainty that I felt a profound shiver run through what remained of my being. I was not just crossing some unknown space. I was being called to something sacred, something eternal, something that had always existed far beyond my limited earthly perception. As I ascended, the light ahead grew more intense, but strangely, it did not hurt my eyes, if I still had eyes. On the contrary, the closer I got, the more I felt an indescribable sense of welcome. It was not just a light, it was a presence, a living, infinite consciousness that enveloped me completely. All the knowledge I had about God from years of study, prayer, and faith seemed insignificant before what I was now experiencing. I not only knew that He existed, I felt Him in every part of my being, and it was something so overwhelming that, if I still had a human heart, it would have crumbled before such greatness. Then within that infinite light, a figure began to form. At first, it was just a stronger glow in the center, like the sun rising on the horizon. But soon it became something more defined, something that my soul recognized even before my mind could comprehend. When my spiritual eyes finally saw clearly, everything within me bowed in reverence. It was Him, Jesus Christ. And in the instant I realized this, I was overcome by an emotion I had never felt in my earthly existence. A love so pure, so absolute, that it pierced through me like a ray of divine light. His gaze penetrated everything that I was. There were no barriers, no secrets, no masks. Jesus saw every thought I had ever had, every doubt, every mistake, every moment of weakness. I was an open book before Him, and that should have filled me with fear. But, to my surprise, there was no condemnation in His gaze. On the contrary, there was a love so deep, so incomprehensible, that my knees, if I still had knees, gave way, and I found myself prostrated before Him. If I could cry, I would have cried. If I could speak, I would have asked for forgiveness. But words were useless there. There was nothing I could say that He did not already know. Then He spoke. His voice was not like any sound I had known. It did not come only from the outside, but vibrated within me, echoing in every particle of my being. It was as if His very essence were speaking directly to my soul. "It is not your time yet." The words were spoken firmly, but without harshness. It was a truth, and I knew that I could not question it. But before I could even try to understand what it meant, everything around me changed. The light dissolved, and in the blink of an eye, I found myself in front of something completely different. Suddenly, I was no longer before Him. I was thrust into a new setting, a place that existed beyond the veil of reality. At first, everything seemed like a vast emptiness, but then images began to emerge before me, as if an invisible curtain had been drawn aside. I saw churches scattered around the world, some radiant with a celestial light, while others were engulfed in dense shadows. Some seemed to vibrate with a sacred presence, an invisible fire that warmed the hearts of the faithful. Others, however, were cold, empty, like abandoned shells, where faith had become nothing more than a lifeless ritual. I saw priests, bishops, and cardinals walking through the corridors of magnificent cathedrals, but some of them looked distant, as if carrying an invisible weight on their shoulders. Then my gaze was drawn to something even more disturbing. I saw sermons being delivered at altars, words spoken with eloquence, but without the true presence of God. I saw churches filled with people who were there merely out of habit, without truly seeking the sacred. And at the same time, I saw small, almost hidden places where faith shone with incredible intensity, devout believers on their knees, praying with such genuine devotion that their prayers soared like living flames to the heavens. The contrast was striking. It was as if there were two realities coexisting within the very church, one still burning with true faith, and another slowly fading away, consumed by indifference and the desire to adapt to the world. My spiritual heart ached at the sight. As a priest, I had always believed that the church was unshakable, but now I saw that its strength did not lie in stone walls or ancient rituals. It lay in the faith of its followers, and that faith was at risk. Then my vision changed again. I was taken to a vast, gloomy field, but it was no ordinary field. It was a battlefield. But unlike the wars of earth, there were no metal weapons, no explosions, no human armies. What I saw was an invisible confrontation to the human eye, yet more real than any war fought in history. Angels and demons fought with an intensity that left me breathless. There was light and darkness in constant clash, each side striving for one thing only: human souls. I realized that this war was not fought with swords or spears, but with something far subtler and more dangerous. The enemy did not attack directly, but acted through doubt, deception, and division. I saw congregations slowly being consumed by empty disputes, religious leaders succumbing to external pressures, sacred messages being distorted to fit the world's expectations. But at the same time, I saw something hopeful. Every true prayer offered by a believer, every genuine act of devotion, every resistance against falsehood strengthened the angels in the battle. I saw that pure faith still held power, a power that few understood. While some succumbed to spiritual coldness, others remained steadfast, and their resistance was like a flame amid the darkness. Then my vision changed once more, and I found myself before the heart of the church on earth, the Vatican. But what I saw there was not merely a sacred place surrounded by historical walls. I could see beyond the surface, into the invisible forces at work there. At the center of it all, I saw Pope Francis kneeling in deep prayer. His face bore an indescribable weight, as if he were bearing a burden far greater than any human should. But what impressed me most was what surrounded him. There were invisible spiritual forces, some radiating a serene light, while others appeared as whispering shadows, trying to influence him in ways I could not fully comprehend. I realized with absolute clarity that he was not merely facing political or administrative challenges. He was in the midst of a fierce spiritual battle, where every decision could change the course of history. Around him, I saw secret meetings taking place, closed rooms, intense debates, religious leaders discussing the future of the church. I saw some fervently defending the tradition and truth of the gospel, while others pushed for changes that seemed to bring progress, but deep down threatened to dilute the essence of the Christian faith. I realized that this was not a simple struggle between good and evil. Many there believed they were doing what was right, but they were being guided by influences that went beyond politics or the desire for modernization. The battle was not against flesh and blood, but against forces that shaped the hearts and minds of those who were supposed to guide the faithful, and for the first time I understood the depth of what was at stake. It was then that Jesus showed me something even more impactful. Two distinct visions of the church's future. The first was luminous, full of hope. I saw churches filled with believers, not out of obligation or empty tradition. They were there because they truly sought the presence of God. I saw priests preaching with courage, unafraid to displease the world, proclaiming the word of Christ without distortions. I saw people on their knees in deep prayer, their souls connected to the divine, their voices rising like burning flames that strengthened the kingdom of heaven. This was a renewed, restored church, a spiritual beacon for a lost world. In that future, I saw mass conversions, a spiritual awakening that no one could have foreseen. The church was returning to what it had always meant to be, the beating heart of God's truth on earth. But then the second vision hit me like a blow to the chest. I saw a dark future where churches were empty, forgotten, transformed into mere historical structures devoid of life. Christianity had been reduced to something irrelevant, a tradition of the past that new generations viewed with indifference. I saw religious leaders who had once been firm in their faith succumbing to the pressures of the world, altering doctrines to become more acceptable, rendering the church indistinguishable from any secular institution. In the desire to please everyone, they had lost what made them unique. The divine brilliance vanished, and in its place there was only darkness and silence. It was a future where the church did not die from persecution, but from complacency. Seeing these two possibilities before me, I felt an overwhelming weight upon my soul. It was as if eternity itself were showing me that nothing was predestined. The fate of the church was not sealed, but rather in the hands of the faithful themselves. I then understood that God would not force humanity to choose the right path. He had already shown the truth, had already sent His Son, had already granted the grace necessary for faith to flourish. But it was up to us to decide whether to preserve that flame or let it die out. The church could be renewed and become again a pillar of light in the world, but only if Christians turned their hearts back to God with sincerity and courage. If they continued to yield to fear, to lukewarmness, and to adapting to the world, decay would be inevitable. My heart burned with the urgency of this revelation. I wanted to ask, to know what could be done, to beg for some guarantee that true faith would prevail. But before I could say anything, Jesus spoke again. "Go back and tell them." His voice resonated within me, as if it were part of my very essence. I wanted to resist. I wanted to say that no one would believe me, that they would think I was crazy, that I would be ridiculed. But he looked at me with absolute firmness, and, before I could argue, he said something that would echo within me forever. "You are not responsible for who believes, only for speaking the truth." Before I could answer, I felt something pulling my being with an irresistible force. It was as if an invisible current was dragging me back, pulling me away from the presence of Christ. My soul resisted. Every part of me cried out to stay, but it was futile. I was being taken back. The light began to recede, the vision of the spiritual battlefield, of the churches, of the Vatican, all started to vanish like a curtain being slowly closed. The last look of Jesus was imprinted in me, still full of love, but laden with an urgency I would never forget. Then suddenly, darkness took over everything. It was an absolute void, without time, without space, only silence. And then in an instant, I was thrown back into my body. The shock was brutal. My lungs filled with air as if I had emerged from drowning. My chest burned, my heart pounded erratically, and everything around me was engulfed in chaos. I heard screams. Doctors and nurses rushed in desperation, machines beeping. Someone exclaimed in pure astonishment, "He's back!" I was back in the world of the living, but something inside me had changed forever. It took me a while to understand what had happened. My body was weak, my mind spinning, but an unshakable certainty dominated my heart. I had been sent back with a mission. In the following days, while I recovered, I tried to put into words everything I had experienced. But how do you explain the inexplicable? How do you describe the look of Christ, the invisible war I witnessed, the future of the church hanging between renewal and oblivion? Even so, I knew I could not remain silent. I began by sharing it with other priests, then with my congregation. Some believed immediately, feeling the weight of the truth in my words. Others looked at me with skepticism, trying to rationalize my experience as a delirium or hallucination. But the reactions did not matter. I understood that my mission was not to convince anyone, but only to speak the truth. Now, each day of my life carries a new purpose. I know that the church and the world stand on the brink of a crucial decision. The time to choose between spiritual renewal and decline is running out. But there is hope, provided that those who still believe have the courage to rise and rekindle the flame of faith. The battle is not over. Prayers still hold power. The destiny of the church has not been sealed. The only question that remains is, will those who hear this message have the courage to act before it is too late?